Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Read, The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. This is the first in what will be a series of videos where I read through the book and give my lay skeptical reading of it. That is, I come from it from a skeptical point of view, where I question the claims it makes and look for the evidence to back them up. But I do this from a lay perspective. I'm not an expert in any of the topics that are covered in the book, and so as I expect are most of the people who read these books. And so I hope to add to the dialogue and with my reading of it. Now, if you'd like to read along with me, I found a copy of the free ebook at archive.org, and I'll put a link in the video description box below. So before we get into the book properly, the subtitle of it is A Journalist Investigates Scientific Evidence That Points Towards God. And I already have some issues with that, in that I'm not convinced that a journalist is the best profession to be seeking scientific evidence. I'm not sure why we don't have scientists doing that. And the idea that there is evidence that points towards God, as somebody who doesn't believe in a God myself, I would need more than evidence that points towards a God in order to be convinced. To me, the idea of an omnipotent creator of everything requires more than just a hint or something that points towards it. You'd actually need better evidence than that to convince me. That aside, maybe that's just the subtitle, that's fine. So, if we look at the actual book itself, it consists of essentially 11 chapters. 3 of the chapters are written entirely by Lee Strobel. The rest of the chapters are actually interviews with other people. So he brings in experts on each of the topics that have been covered and he interviews them. And that's what forms the bulk of the book. And so the idea is that because he's interviewing experts, he's getting expert opinion on these things. Now in this video I'm going to cover chapters 1 and 2, mainly because chapter 1 is actually a very short chapter that's much more of a sort of introduction to the book. And that will lay out, I guess, the sort of outline of where he's going. So, chapter 1, white-coated scientists versus black-robed preachers. So the whole of chapter 1, essentially, almost all of it, is a telling of when Strobel was a journalist, one of his first professional jobs, working in Chicago, and how he got sent down to, I think, West Virginia to cover some civil unrest that was occurring over some textbooks that seemed to have some evolution or other sort of scientific stuff in them that was against the prevailing Christianity at the time, and how people were protesting about this. And so the whole of the story, Strobel is at that point an avowed atheist. And so it's his sort of telling of how he comes, he's sent out to cover this story of these Christians who are protesting against textbooks from his atheist perspective. And he does a pretty good job of being quite anti-Christian. So, as he says on chapter 9, and I quote, "But there was also an undercurrent of something else, an inchoate fear of the future, of change, of new ideas, of cultural transformation. I could sense a simmering frustration in people over how modernity was eroding the foundation of their faith. Many of the protesters, wrote the Charleston Gazette, are demonstrating against a changing world." And I think this captures what a lot of atheists would say about Christians. I actually think in this chapter Strobel does actually a pretty good job of capturing the cultural criticisms that atheists have of Christians, particularly in the US, that they generally are arguing against change. They genuinely are conservative, not progressivists. That they generally they are threatened by the cultural changes that modernity brings about, and with it a sort of an almost inevitable atheism that comes through the sort of the acceptance of scientific truths, and of a sort of a secular morality that we've been pushing. And in this opening chapter, although he is quite dismissive of a lot of these Christians, I think he gets a lot of the criticisms right. And actually he does a very good job of, I guess, outlining the sort of the conflict also that people see between Christianity on one hand and a sort of atheism informed by science on the other hand. Now he wraps it all up in terms of making it all out to be evolution, as if evolution necessarily is anti-religion, and there's debate over that, and we'll get into that a lot more later. And the other thing he does consistently that I don't like is he always calls it Darwinism as much as he can, and he always talks about it as if it's Darwinism. Where we are 150, 200 years or so later after Darwin, evolution is not Darwinism. Evolution is a lot more than Darwin. But other than that, I think he's got some of this right. Let's have another quote. "Let me put it this way," he said. "If Darwin's right, we're just sophisticated monkeys. The Bible is wrong. There is no God. And without God, there's no right or wrong. You can just make up our morals as we go. The basis for all we believe is destroyed. And that's why this country is headed to hell in a handbasket. Is Darwin responsible? I'll say this. People have to choose between science and faith, between evolution and the Bible, between the Ten Commandments, and make 'em up as you go ethics. We've made our choice, and we're not budging." And I think this does sum up a fair amount of Christians these days. And to a lesser extent, atheists would agree that essentially it is a choice between believing in the results of modern science and rejecting them in order to maintain a religious worldview. And I think the big part is that that the Christians get wrong, and particularly in this quote, is this idea that we should argue from consequences, that we should stick with our religion simply because we don't like the consequences of what science has shown us to be true. I mean, whether evolution has happened, whether the theory of evolution is right, whether the whole of modern biology that is founded on it is correct, is true regardless of whether you like the consequences of it. And so, in one sense, yeah, it's a choice of which way you want to go, but there's only one choice that's going to be right. There may be only one choice that's comforting, and that might not be the same. Let's have another quote. "Didn't he know that evolution is a proven fact? Didn't he realise in an age of science and technology that it's simply irrational to believe the ancient myths about God creating the world and shaping human beings in his own image? Did he really want his children clinging desperately to religious pap that is so clearly disproved by modern cosmology, astronomy, zoology, comparative anatomy, geology, paleontology, biology, genetics, and anthropology?" Now, I both like and dislike this quote. What I dislike is this idea that we are in an age of science and technology, and that somehow the rejection of these previous beliefs should be based around the age in which we're in, that is the zeitgeist, or simply the sort of time period. The thing is, whether evolution is true or not, well, evolution is true. It's always been true. We just haven't known about it. So even in an age of myth and superstition, evolution still had happened. And had we the evidence to believe in evolution 2,000 years ago, then we should have believed in it. And so I don't like this possibly trying to sort of suggest that people should be atheists or not atheists based on the feeling of the time. I mean, on one hand, I think he's right that this is an age of science and technology, but that's just simply as a result of us having the evidence, rather than any kind of cultural shift where we just want to be an age of science and technology. The other thing I do like about this quote is that actually he's right, that the problem that, say, Christianity in particular, but a lot of religions have with science is not just with one little part of science. It's not just, even if you, and that's not even to say that evolution is a small part, it isn't, but that, an even sort of cursory glance at the Bible would show that it is clearly contradicted by all of those fields that he's listed: cosmology, astronomy, zoology, etc., etc. And that if you honestly want to be able to believe that the Bible is true, then you have to somehow find a way to undermine every single one of those sciences. And I worry that he thinks he can do that in a book this size. I'm not sure that he's going to be able to present enough evidence to completely unfound all of those modern sciences. I'm open to be shown. Maybe there's some secret thing that maybe there's a house of cards that's built on one tiny little thing. There's all of this scientific knowledge that's based on one faulty assumption, that once he can unpick it for us, it'll all fall down and we'll be able to remake our knowledge in line with the truth that he's going to show us. And I hope so. Okay, so there's this long story that he tells of going down to West Virginia and interviewing all the people on both sides of the textbook wars. And, to those people who are not familiar with the history of the US, or particularly, as far as I can tell, it's something not too far from the Snopes trial, and it's something that's probably been happening a lot throughout US history is, on one side you've got people who want to bring in textbooks that basically tell the truth as modern science has revealed it, and other people who don't want that being taught in school because of the consequences of it eroding their children's faith. And he just does a fairly good job of telling that. He, says that he's an atheist, and I take that at face value. He does a pretty sneering job at describing Christians in not particularly flattering ways. I'm not sure if he sees it as flattering and I just simply don't, or whether he also is trying to portray these particular brand of Christians unflatteringly as sort of Bible-thumping preaching types. But either way, it fits quite nicely with certainly the stereotype and to some extent the reality of Christians as I've experienced them on YouTube and around the place. And then right at the very end of the chapter, he sort of sums it up with this quote, and this is actually a quote from a professor called William Provine, but he's quoting Provine. If Darwinism is true, he said, then there are 5 inescapable conclusions. There's no evidence for God, there's no life after death, there's no absolute foundation for right and wrong, there's no ultimate meaning for life, and people don't really have free will. Essentially, this quote is correct. Again, Provine's actually not talking about Darwinism, he's talking about evolution and all of the rest of it that comes along, but and not all of those conclusions absolutely follow from evolution being true, but certainly evolution being true makes all of those very likely. I don't know whether that means that there's no existence for God, but certainly the God of the Bible, as depicted, especially in Genesis, is completely destroyed by evolution. That God can't exist. God can't have created man on the 6th day in his own image, if evolution is true. And so, yeah, that is the challenge. But again, I worry that he's setting this up to be an argument from consequence. That things will be really bad if evolution is true. You'll lose all these things that you want to be true, and therefore we should reject it. When ultimately, whether it's true or not rests on the evidence. Now, I tend to believe that he was an atheist. I know some people may have thought, well, he probably wasn't really an atheist, or, he probably is only saying he's an atheist. And I know that there's a sort of a tendency amongst Christians, especially evangelicals, to sort of talk about their atheist path as if that gives them sort of atheist street cred or something. But I believe that he probably was. I think that his reasons for being an atheist, certainly on my reading of this book, were quite different than my reasons for being an atheist, and certainly different from a lot of other YouTube atheists at the moment. I kind of think, looking at his responses, that he's probably more of what I think of as a cultural atheist. He seemed to have accepted the conclusions of science without necessarily understanding the methods or processes thereof. And sort of, accepted, okay, so God doesn't exist because science disproved it. And that's fine. I actually think that's okay to trust in the consensus of experts. That's anything that we're not ourselves experts in, we will have to defer to a consensus of experts. And that's okay, as long as in principle any one of us could become an expert and test that evidence ourselves. Then it's open for testing. It's not viable for us all to be experts in every field, and so we do need to rely on these. And as long as it's a deferral to a consensus of experts, and as I say, the evidence is in principle testable by yourself, then I see that as fine. And so, yeah, unlike some, I would say that, on the basis of fairly sort of straightforward reading of the book, he seems to have been an atheist, just, as I say, a cultural atheist. And not somebody who's sort of reasoned themselves long and hard into that position, but somebody who's just accepted what's been told to them and moved forward with it. And that's it for chapter 1. As I said, it's essentially a sort of a long introduction, if you like. A long story about how, as a journalist, he, was introduced to some of this conflict. Chapter 2 is called The Images of Evolution. So this chapter is a bit of a mishmash. So there's a big chunk of that that's a personal account of his journey to atheism. And I take this at face value. Some people would seem the need to sort of question this, about whether he was a true atheist or not. To me it seems fairly straightforward. He's got some quite nice quotes in here, and because he presents this as a personal journey, I actually feel like it might be useful to look into what his reasons were for coming to atheism. I wouldn't normally do this with people with theists who are arguing for the existence of God, but Strobel puts his personal journey out there as relevant to the case, and therefore I think it's something that's fair game. So here's a nice quote. "My trust in science had been shaped by growing up in post-Sputnik America, where science and technology had been exalted as holding keys to the survival of our country. The Eisenhower administration had exhorted young people to pursue careers in science, so America could catch up with and surpass our enemy, the Soviets, who had stunned the world in 1957 by launching the world's first artificial satellite into an elliptical orbit around Earth. Later, as our nation began unravelling in the 60s, when social conventions were being turned upside down, when relativism and situational ethics were starting to create a quicksand of morality, when one tradition after another was being upended, I saw science as remaining steady, a foundation, an anchor, always rock solid in its methodology, while at the same time constantly moving forward in a reflection of the American can-do spirit." Now, despite him saying methodology in that, it does sound like, to me, that he was looking for some kind of absolute to ground himself in what was a very turbulent time. 60s in particular it was a very frightening time in America. You had a Cold War type fear of destruction from outside, along with a social upheaval of civil rights movement, sexual liberation, which was also threatening sort of destruction from within. So America was being remade from within as well as being threatened from without, and a time of great fear for people. And so it does sound to me like he was looking for something to grab hold of, and that he saw science as remaining steady in that. Now, to some extent, scientific methodology hasn't changed a lot, but it's hardly something that could be said to be supportive of the status quo socially. A lot of the sexual revolution, civil rights movement, etc., these things were not... science was, if anything, was supportive, or most people would say it was neutral on a lot of these things. And it seems to me, in the telling of it, that Strobel was really putting science on a pedestal rather than seeing its limitations. That science is not this sort of rock solid thing you can hang your hat on that tells you how to live your life, what's true and what's real and what's valuable in life. Yeah, science cannot be the thing that you can rely on to ground yourself in terms of giving you meaning in life or teaching you ethics, morality. These kind of things I think are best grounded in philosophies like humanism, rather than in science particularly. And so I suspect that part of his journey back to Christianity, which we are going to later see, came from the fact that his journey to atheism was based on shaky foundations. Okay, so then after this story of Strobel's descent into atheism, as it were, he gets into the actual guts of this chapter, which is the images of evolution. And basically he points out that there are these four sort of iconic images that he says were pivotal in his trust of science and therefore, deconversion from Christianity. And the idea here that he sort of puts forward that there's these four images that to him sort of really exemplified the sort of the science. They're not quite all evolutionary images, but this sort of evolution, and that really made a convert of him. And even before we get into what these images are, I've got an issue with that. Pictures and things, there might be some debate on this, but generally speaking, pictures are important in the communication of science. So diagrams and drawings and pictures and images and all the rest of it are very important when we're communicating science to non-scientists, but also between scientists. But ultimately, these generally don't count as evidence. The results of experiments, etc., generally don't come down to, particular images, unless these are replicable, unless these are images we can repeat over and over. But generally speaking, so when we think of the theory of evolution, because that's what he's going to tackle mostly here, the evidence for evolution does not rest particularly on images. The images are a useful way of encapsulating some of these ideas, but they also have limitations. but they are not the evidence on which evolution is built. The evidence that evolution is built on is a whole range of other things, and the drawings that we make of that and the images that we have of that are generally used as a way of communicating those ideas. So I worry a bit that he's put forward this idea that he was converted to atheism because of science, and he was generally convinced of the science by these 4 images, and then we're going to look at these images, and I suspect what we're going to find is he's then going to turn them on their head and go, images were flawed, therefore my science can't be trusted, therefore I shouldn't have converted to atheism, or something like that. And I just don't see that as being a stand-up argument. That said, let's get into the images. So image number 1, the tubes, flasks and electrodes of the Stanley Miller experiment. Now, he calls it Stanley Miller experiment, and he seems to have this thing about attributing these things to particular people, in the same way that he calls it Darwinism rather than evolution. And it's not actually the Miller experiment, it's the Miller-Urey experiment. There's actually a number of people who worked on it. And this one's actually, to me, this is a simply stunning result. This is from 1953, I believe. Simply having a mixture of water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen. Okay, so we're looking at 3 gases and a liquid which were basically known to exist on planet Earth in abundance in the sort of primordial era. You mix them together, you put them in a closed circuit that's got heat and electricity sparking through it, right? And you leave it. And what do you find? The water mixture thing goes a sort of a sludgy kind of reddy pink, I think, and that of the 20 amino acids that we know are essential to life as we know it, at least 11 of those will be have been spontaneously formed in those conditions. This is stunning because it shows that you can take something as simple as water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen, which we know are produced by simple chemical processes in abundance in the primordial Earth, and that from that you can get them to convert into amino acids, which are relatively complex chemical molecules that are absolutely necessary for life as we know it, and you can create it simply with heat and a spark. This shows that then for at least those 11, and in fact actually later analysis has shown that you can possibly produce all 20, and there's a lot. It's not quite the sort of the open and shut case just yet, but it shows that at least in principle there's no reason that these kinds of chemical building blocks which were necessary for creating life required anything other than purely natural chemical processes. And that's amazing. Abiogenesis, or the production of life from non-life, if you like, for almost all of human history was thought to absolutely require some kind of supernatural creator. It was unfathomable for most people how you could possibly go from non-life to life, and this showed that it was absolutely possible, that there was no good reason to continue to suspect, to hold out that this was something that was in principle impossible. And so this was an absolutely astoundingly important experiment. Okay, image number 2, Darwin's Tree of Life. And here he talks about that on the origin of species, Darwin has one diagram particularly, and this is the Tree of Life diagram, which has all the sort of species that are living at the moment, and how they're all kind of like the branches or the leaves on a tree, and at the joining of those leaves to branches and branches to branches all the way down to the trunk is a sort of a nice metaphor for the universal descent that evolution argues for. Now, in his description of it, he talks about microevolution versus macroevolution. Now, this is the kind of mainstay of creationists. Creationists love to divide evolution into micro and macroevolution. This is not a distinction that actual scientists use, but it is one that is quite intuitive. So the intuitive distinction is that variation within a species or kind or something, so all the different kinds of dogs, if you like, of all the variation of dogs, is microevolution. So when a dog evolves to get smaller and smaller and ends up a chihuahua, then that's microevolution. But evolution that results in a change of species or kind or something is macroevolution. So as long as it's still a dog, that's microevolution, but if it evolves into something that's not a dog, that's macroevolution. Now, it's not quite like that, because and this is where the problem is, that the creationists won't ever actually define exactly what the distinction is. They'll tend to say, but it's obvious. But usually it's like, oh, well, wolf to dog is okay, even though everybody would accept they're different species. I'll say, no, that's right, they're the same kind. Basically, the only way that you could have a sensible distinction between micro and macroevolution is if you could have a boundary to say that cumulative microevolution could not cross this boundary. For example, that is, a species can grow or shrink a certain amount. That's okay. That's microevolution, but it can't grow or lose limbs. That would be macroevolution. But there's no limit like that we found. So, to some extent, any kind of species boundary, or what is one species and what is a different species, is somewhat arbitrary. And so this whole macroevolution is really just a sort of creationist ploy to play on our intuitions about that a certain amount of evolution allows something to stay within its species or kind, as the creationists like to say. But anything more than that would be, we haven't shown that macroevolution can happen, and therefore. The other thing I want to say is that this Darwin's tree of life, that evolution in itself wasn't a particularly amazing insight that Darwin had. I'm pretty sure other people around, and even before that, had these ideas. And they came from completely... a lot of Christians had already seen this tree of life based on things like comparative anatomy. And so Linnaeus, who came up with maybe the first classification system, was a creationist, was a Christian of some description, and he basically, just based on the form, the shape of animals, classified them into ones which were more closely related or more distantly related, just based on things like skeleton, and etc., etc. And even from that point, it was clear that most things had a common ancestor. I don't think you could go as far as to say everything did, but it was clear, just based on physical morphology, that things had common ancestors. That this tree of life thing was probably right. In fact, they had trouble trying to distinguish. They always wanted to cut humans out of the animal kingdom, but could never come up with an objective basis on which to do that. So even before Darwin came along, this tree of life thing was already fairly well established, that that's what the evidence was showing. Darwin's particular contribution, and the thing that he did so well at explaining, was actually the natural selection, which was his explanation of the mechanism by which species diverge. But the fact that species had diverged from common ancestors was something that was fairly well, not fairly well, but a lot of people had already thought of that and already seen that in the animal kingdom. And so actually, the tree of life was not something that was particularly, owned by Darwin. Maybe he popularised it, but it wasn't an idea that he came up with independent, that nobody else did. Image number 3 is Ernest Haeckel's drawings of embryos. Now, anybody who's sort of come across creationists knows that they love this. So basically what this is that shortly after, I think, Origin of Species, or maybe after around 150 years ago or so, Ernest Haeckel did a textbook on embryology, and he had several drawings of embryos at various stages. And the fascinating thing is that when looking at the embryos of different animals, they were remarkably similar. In fact, indistinguishable often, even though we were looking at animals that were so different, like fish, tortoises, chickens, humans. There's no reason to think that fish and humans or chickens or tortoises should have similar embryos. They're quite different final animals, but actually when you look at the early stage embryos, they all look remarkably similar. And at the time, this was widely considered, this was, strong evidence for evolution. The thing that most creationists miss when they try and criticise this work is that Haeckel's drawings were not surprising to anybody who knew about embryology at the time. So Haeckel wasn't presenting new knowledge and saying, oh, look how similar these things are, and people go, oh wow, I didn't know that. Actually, everybody who knew about embryology at the time knew that these things were incredibly similar. The criticism was that one of his drawings, in his first edition of his textbook, he had simply copied, for the early stage embryos, he'd simply copied the woodcut 3 times. So they were literally identical drawings because they were the same woodcut. The interesting thing is that because this was so widely known, this was picked up immediately. He was criticised for it. There's some argument that he was charged with fraud. There's some argument that that never actually happened. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's corrected in the second edition. So by the time the second edition book came out, this had been changed. And the thing again is that the controversy at the time, what little controversy there was, well, actually, was not about whether or not he was right in saying that these embryos were the same. Everybody accepted that they were staggeringly similar for such disparate creatures. There was no argument that could be mounted for why God would have made these embryos absolutely the same. This was such a strong argument for common descent. The controversy at the time was, one, had he just copied the same woodcut rather than actually doing the legwork and getting, diagrams of the 3 different embryos? But secondly, the main controversy was about whether this should be communicated to the public. So actually the big controversy was the scientists who already knew this, recognized this as such a strong challenge to Christianity. They were actually arguing that this shouldn't be published in a publicly accessible form, that this should essentially be kept secret from the public because the public wouldn't be able to bear such a challenge to their Christianity. That's what the controversy was over. And the images that he presented, aside from the 3, he actually presented these beautifully detailed plates of all sorts of later stage embryos, etc., and contrasting the similarities and differences between them. These were never discredited. And part of the reason why they're still used today is because they're such strong evidence, and it's amazingly good for something that was produced like 150 years ago. Now the 4th image that he talks about is Archaeopteryx. And basically, Archaeopteryx, for anyone who doesn't know, is a dinosaur. It's discovered in China. It's a fossil of a dinosaur. It was discovered in China shortly after, I think, Darwin died. And it is clearly a transitional form between reptiles and birds. It is essentially a feathered dinosaur. And it, too, was considered very strong evidence for evolution. Evolution predicted that we should find these things. Evolution predicted that if birds had evolved from dinosaurs, that we should find bird-like dinosaurs, dinosaurs with feathers, etc., and we did. And the particularly strong part of this is that this came after the origin of the species. So this was a true prediction. This wasn't we look back and we can interpret what we already know in light of what the new theory. This is a prediction of what we should find, and then we go out and we find it. And this kind of thing has actually happened time and time again since the origin of species, and since a lot of that seminal work had been done, is that scientists would go, okay, well, we have, here we have fish at this age, and we know that we have animals walking on the ground with 4 legs at this time later. So somewhere in the rock layer between there, we should find some kind of transitional form. So then we go to modern geology, we look to where in the world we should find rock layers of that age. We then go to those places and we dig, and time again, we found transitional forms right where we think it should be. And the fact that evolution can make that prediction, we can follow through on it and find these things, is very, very good evidence for evolution. Okay, so that's the 4 images. So then Strobel goes into this idea of Darwin versus God and Darwin's universal acid. And the idea here is that he wants to make it clear that you basically, either evolution is true or Christianity is true, but not both. Some would argue that maybe neither, but certainly not both. And what he wants to do here is to really get out those Christians who want to have both. So he wants to say to those Christians who want to somehow think that to have their evolution and their Christianity, he wants to say, no, that these are conflicting worldviews. And the thing is, this is probably the only common ground that some Christians have with atheists. Atheists would agree, a lot of atheists would agree, that essentially, not just evolution, but other sciences, so flatly contradict a world in which a Christian creator God existed that you can't possibly have both. A widespread theological view now exists saying that God started off the world, props it up, and works through the laws of nature very subtly, so subtly that its action is undetectable. But that kind of God is effectively no different to my mind than atheism. And I would agree that essentially the God of the gaps has been shrunk down to some very small gaps, that science explains almost all of what the traditional Christian God was supposed to have done, to the point where it is hard to believe in a traditional Christian God. And so then there's been this theological retreat by sort of moderate Christians or theologians into a kind of God that does less and less of what the Bible says that a Christian God should do. He then goes on to this idea of Darwin's universal acid. He quotes Daniel Dennett, who originated this concept, and that's just simply the idea that once you understand evolution or Darwin's sort of natural selection idea, that essentially this will remake your worldview. And in the idea of a universal acid, an acid so strong that it would dissolve everything, that's what Darwin's idea does. Basically, it destroys any kind of teleological argument, an argument from design. And one of the implications of this, he says, is that life has no ultimate meaning, no absolute morality, no ultimate justice, and I'd agree with that. So then Strobel talks about his personal experience of how he reacted after having his worldview remade. And I quote, "Rather than facing this unyielding despair that's implicit in a world without God, I revelled in my newly achieved freedom from God's moral strictures. For me, living without God meant living 100% for myself. Freed from someday being held accountable for my actions, I felt unleashed to pursue personal happiness and pleasure at all costs. The sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s was starting to dawn, and I was liberated to indulge as much as I wanted, without having to look over my shoulder at God's disapproving gaze. As a journalist, I was unshackled to compete, without always having to abide by those pesky rules of ethics and morality. I would let nothing, and certainly nobody, stand between me and my ambitions." To a small extent, I agree with this. That is, to the limited extent, I think that people shouldn't restrict their behaviour or feel guilty about the things they do due to some of the dictates of a non-existent God. However, the full picture he describes as somebody who's living entirely for himself. This I cannot agree with. This is atheism without humanism. This is leaving Christianity and embracing some kind of self-serving hedonism or egoism or something. And the thing is, there are good secular arguments against that. I mean, there are really well thought out, argued for positions of, ethical goodness that don't rely on a God. So just because you leave your Christianity behind doesn't mean you have to embrace some kind of self-centeredness, which is ultimately actually what almost no atheists I know actually have done. Because this atheism that he describes, this is the atheism that Christians like to caricature all atheists as. And it's just not that common. I mean, I can't talk about the time and the place when Strobel was like that, but in the here and now, I know no atheists who are like that. I know no... I've never come across an atheist who is making those kind of arguments. And if they exist, they are definitely in the minority in most places. And really what that quote tells me is simply that Strobel has difficulty being good without God, which is not the same as most atheists that I know. And in fact, really, I suspect that if that was an honest, description of what he was like when he lost his faith, then I suspect that's why he distrusts atheists. That's why he thinks religion is a valuable thing. But his own difficulties, sort of, finding a secular morality, is not really an argument against atheism. Especially given that we know that atheism doesn't even lead to that kind of hedonism, egoism necessarily. Okay, so the next little section is called The Investigation Begins. And in this way, this section, Strobel lays out how his wife became a Christian, and she transformed into somebody who was, as he says, more loving and caring and authentic. And then he decides, being the evidence-based rationalist that he's asserted himself to be since the beginning, that he will go wherever the answers would take me. And so he kind of wraps up this chapter more or less, with what he says, 3 questions, and I quote. 1. Are science and faith doomed to always be at war? That is there a fundamentally different way to view the relationship between the spiritual and the scientific? Does the latest scientific evidence tend to point toward or away from the existence of God? Are those images of evolution that spurred me to atheism still valid in light of the most recent discoveries in science? Now, question 1 is a good question, but note that it's a philosophical question, not a scientific one. That is, whether or not faith and science are doomed to always be at war depends on your philosophical position on what is and is not science. You know, that's a philosophy of science question. And what is faith? What does that mean? These are questions outside of the scope of much of science. But it's a good question, and I think we're going to get to that in the next chapter. Now, question 2 can be answered in a number of ways, but particularly by looking at whether scientists are becoming more or less religious. And the evidence seems to be quite strongly in one way, that the more scientific knowledge somebody has, overwhelmingly the correlation is that they become less and less religious. This would be strong prima facie evidence that scientific evidence is pointing away from the existence of God. But I'm sure we're going to go through the rest of the book to find out what he thinks. Question 3, whether or not those images are still valid is, of his personal interest. But as I noted before, they, in themselves, are not much evidence. They are neat kind of encapsulations of some ideas within the scientific knowledge, but they're not really particularly important one way or the other, because the evidence for evolution, etc., will stand and fall on its own. And so the last question strikes me as not being particularly useful, unless you're setting up a straw man that you can knock down. Okay, so then he goes on to say that basically those are the questions he asked himself. Then he was going to have a look at all sorts of things and come to a decision. So, and I quote, "My approach would be to cross-examine authorities in various scientific disciplines about the most current findings in their fields. In selecting these experts, I sought doctorate-level professors who have unquestioned expertise, are able to communicate in accessible language, and who refuse to limit themselves only to the politically correct world of naturalism or materialism. After all, it wouldn't make sense to rule out any hypothesis at the outset. I wanted the freedom to pursue all possibilities. I would stand in the shoes of the skeptic, reading all sides of each topic and posing the toughest objections that have been raised." So I've got several problems here. First of all, wouldn't a better approach be to look at the consensus of experts? Rather than finding one expert to ask on each topic, wouldn't it be a much better approach to look at what are the overall opinion of the experts? And look, non-materialistic or non-naturalistic explanations have really significant philosophical problems. Much of the proposed behaviours or characteristics of the Christian God are distinctly material, and hence are amenable to mainstream scientific investigation. I mean, if you needed non-materialistic explanations in order to sort of really understand enough about God, then evolution wouldn't be a direct threat to God. The reason there's a conflict is because God is said to intervene in the natural world. He's said to do things that have a completely naturalistic or material impact. And therefore, even if science was methodologically naturalistic, the fact that it comes to conclusions which show that you don't need a God to explain all sorts of things is enough of an issue that you don't need to choose to understand the issues, to understand the conflict. You don't need to have your experts be amenable to non-materialistic explanations. The second thing is, look, if overwhelming majority of experts hold a particular view X, and you insist that you're only going to choose those experts that don't hold that view, so as you can keep an open mind, you're almost certainly going to only get experts who tell you that view is wrong. That's just the nature of it. If 98% of people say, "Oh yeah, to do science you have to believe, methodological naturalism," and 2% say, "No, you don't," if you say, "Well, to keep my options open, I'm going to go with that 2%," well, you're almost certainly going to find somebody, the person you pick is almost certainly going to tell you, you don't need to be methodologically naturalist. What would be a better approach is to go to somebody in the 98%, or actually the overwhelming majority of, and say, "Why don't you think that supernatural explanations are particularly useful?" Also, interviewing one person on each topic doesn't actually allow you to read all sides, and as a journalist, Strobel is hardly qualified to pose the toughest objections. The best people to do that would be other experts in the field, which is the whole purpose behind things like peer review and looking at the consensus of experts. That allows experts to cross-examine experts and come to some kind of consensus. And lastly, the chapter closes with Strobel appealing to us to keep an open mind and go into the rest of the book with, strip away our preconceptions. And although I'm, at this point not particularly convinced that he's going to have the kind of evidence that he needs in order to overturn as he's pointed out, the majority of modern science, I will have as an open mind as I can. I'm interested to see whether he has decent arguments and evidence against evolution, and whether he has decent arguments and evidence for a creator. And in the next video, we'll be looking at chapter 3. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.